as the key feature of Russian President Vladimir Putin's two-day visit to New Delhi. An arms deal worth more than $5 billion for the delivery of state-of-the-art weapons platform. The S-400 missile system has caused concern and ire from Washington D.C. But what does it mean for India's defense strategy and its neighbors? How would possible U.S. sanctions impact the close defense ties between India and Russia? And what is India's strategy regarding the respective influences of the U.S., Russia and China? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Su Hao from China Foreign Affairs University and Mr. Atul Aneja, an associate editor with The Hindu. We'll also speak via satellite to Viktor Ulich, who is a political analyst and lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics in Moscow. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pando. Well, Mr. Aneja, I'd like to start with you. Why is this $5 billion deal so important for India?
Well, it's just not the number 5 billion, but what it really entails and what significance it has. What it means is that it's relaying the foundations of the India-Russia relations in our era. And I think that's very significant because you're having not just weaponry, but something which acquisition of which will have major geopolitical significance.
So you're saying that this is more of a political gesture rather than a simple arms deal?
Yeah, it's definitely S-400, if you're talking about that, is a very, very potent air defense weapon. So there's no question about the quality and the significance of this weapon. But this goes beyond the capability of a weapon system. There's a political signal which is coming through, and that is a signal of continuity and trust between India and Russia, which, as you know, dates back from the days of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. So I think that is something which is very, very significant. And the timing of it is also very important because this is taking place at a time when the Americans have come into the picture and have been vocal in objecting to the sale of this weapon. So in a way, this is also an assertion by India of its sovereignty and its doctrine of strategic autonomy, and that is a doctrine which came into being in 1998 when India tested its nuclear weapons. So,
and we'll go through that one by one later in the program. But now let's get back to timing. Professor Su, what do you make of the timing of this deal? Is India under particular threat from the air?
Well, yeah, it is a critical time at the moment regarding this kind of arms sales from Russia. Actually, we know that's just 1 month ago. There's the so-called 2+2 dialogue between United States and India. So they're talking quite a lot about so-called defense cooperation. Even it's arms sale cooperation. United States would like to try to enhance its, cooperative role in India's weaponry system establishment. So United States would like to give more, like the high-tech weaponry system, or even some kind of high-tech information sharing with India. So makes the international community a bit suspicious about India's position. Maybe too more close to the United States. So at this time, that's our Indian friend said that this is a political gesture. That means India wants to keep the same distance between the big powers like United States and Russia, of course, with China. So that means India will have to keep their some kind of special position among the big powers play games. So by this way, India will have more flexibility to manage its relation with all the big powers.
Right, so you've brought in the U.S. element in this whole situation. So, Mr. Aneja, let's talk more about this 2+2 dialogue between India and the United States. A major landmark security pact came out of this. It's called COMCASA, the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement. Why all of a sudden the United States is taking so much interest in India's strategic planning?
Well, I think there are two elements to it. One is India's geographic location, and so therefore, the direction, the way India pivots will have a significance not just in the region, but probably beyond that. So that's the significance of India, which the Americans have realized, but that's not something which is new, which has been there for a long time. But I think there is also an element of the Trump administration coming here and the transactional relationship which wants to establish, given its relationship with Russia and with China after the so-called trade war which has started. So India becomes important in that light from an American perspective. third is the military hardware trade. I think if, from the American point of view, it's pretty transparent now that they want to make India a major defense partner. And if you want to make India a major defense partner, something like what its allies are, like New Zealand or Australia or Japan, then there are certain homework which has to be done in terms of what they call interoperability. And once you have that, then your weapon systems sort of get integrated.
So put it in a simple way, the United States also wants to sell more weapons to India.
I think that's very, very important. And all the effort which is taking place is to make sure that the Indian door of weapon acquisitions is wide open to the Americans. So the Indian message which is coming in is, we can cooperate with you, but we will not be dependent on you. I think the relationship of dependency is something which India opposes, because that can be used politically, and finally it can compromise your sovereignty. So that's where the balancing act takes place, that okay, this far, but you know, we have other partners as well, so that we are not entirely dependent on you in a political sense. So that's why I think it's more of assertion of India's sovereignty and strategic autonomy, while being open to an engagement with the United States.
And Professor Su, how much are the U.S. interests in India's weapons acquisition linked to the U.S. proposed so-called Indo-Pacific strategy? And the U.S. has making it very clear that this is in this region to curb China's influence.
Yes, actually we know that Donald Trump already have so-called American national defense and national security strategy. Take China as a so-called competitor, strategic competitor. So United States would like to build some kind of the Indo-Pacific framework around China. So make China as so-called target for its containment or something like the constraint, against China. So India would be a critical role in this kind of framework. Actually, we know that India, in the past, they have some kind of problem with China regarding their territorial disputes, regarding some kind of Pakistan issue, or regarding the regional so-called dominance, competition with each other. So United States would like to take advantage of such kind of suspicion from Indian side on China.
But let's face the reality. China and India are close neighbors, and both of them are populous and major countries.
Of course.
So they will find a way to, coexist with each other, whether the United States like it or not, right?
Yeah. American side will have some kind of the strategic assessment, say that India could be the strategic partner with the United States, take something other enemy, so-called the competitor, as their common ground to enhance their cooperation with each other. But that's the American side's thinking way. But from Indian side, India has their tradition of the autonomies, or tradition has the leadership of the non-alignment movement. So India would like to be independent, big powers, keep its distance with among other big powers. So India would like to, on the one hand, to keep its traditional relation with China as an economic partnership, or somehow the strategic implementation, and of course had a strategic partnership with Russia, even in the Cold War period. This is tradition, all right? So at the moment, India would like to keep this balance among big powers, so make India has a much more strategic choice to make India have the self-dependence, independence to manage its relation with other big powers.
Well, you just mentioned India's non-alignment policy, but Mr. Aneja, some observers are saying that maybe India is shifting a little bit away from this non-alignment policy and trying to, what do you make of this?
I think the spirit of non-alignment, which is of not surrendering your independent thinking to another power, that spirit remains. Non-aligned movement took place in a certain context of the Cold War. We don't have that context, so therefore it changes its form. There is I think India supports multipolarity and an active engagement with the various poles of the global system. So that is the transition which has taken place from non-alignment to an engagement with the multipolar world. Where does China fit into it? I think what we got to do is see, as I say it, is that we got to see Mr. Putin's visit today to New Delhi as a sequel to the Wuhan summit which took place in China in April. And this is Modi's message that, okay, Indo-Pacific as a military construct, we are not interested. Okay, we may cooperate in other fields, but we can't go so far as to become a partner in containment of China. And that's why Wuhan summit did take place, and we sent that message, followed by the SCO summit in Qingdao. So I think India's balance between the Indo-Pacific and Eurasia is now coming into the picture. And as I see it with Wuhan, which I think is one of the signature initiatives that Prime Minister Modi has taken, and Putin's visit today, I think they have to be seen together as India balancing its relationship much more profoundly than has been appreciated, especially in the media and in the Western media. So there is definite course correction which has taken place, and we can see something very, very visible and tangible coming out of it now.
But we've already widened the scope. So let's go back to deal. And for Russian perspective, let's talk to Mr. Viktor Olevich in Moscow. Mr. Olevich, what's the significance of this major arms deal for Russia?
Well, as my colleagues have correctly pointed out, India is trying to leverage its relationship with Russia, the United States, and China in its own interests. But the approach that the Trump administration has taken towards India is quite ambiguous, and it's similar to the approach it's been taking to other states. For example, the Trump administration believes that India and wants India to play a more significant role in its strategy against the People's Republic of China. In fact, the U.S. Pacific Command has in the recent months been renamed into the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So the strategy is actually changing from Asia-Pacific into Indo-Pacific, which basically signifies how important India is how important India's role is in America's new strategy in Asia, strategy to contain, so to say, China and Chinese ambitions. But at the same time, the United States, the Trump administration, has taken a number of steps that have not been received very well in Delhi. First of all, the United States has applied significant pressure on India to cut its imports, its oil imports from Iran, and generally take a step down in Indian-Iranian relations. And considering the role that Iranian energy exports have played in the Indian economy, this was a very serious step for India. And Delhi actually went with the United States on that topic, on that issue, and agreed to essentially, starting in November, faced with potential American sanctions, India is cutting oil imports from Iran essentially almost to zero, which is a detrimental step for the Indian economy. Secondly, the United States, the Trump administration, had announced major trade tariffs on steel and aluminum, which also impacted Indian industry. And thirdly, the United States, the Trump administration, had been attempting for a long time to prevent the Russian deal, the Russian-Indian deal, to sell S-400 air defense systems to India, which would bring over $5 billion into Russian coffers, and which would ensure that India had an independent supply of weapons, and that Russia remained competitive force.
Well, Mr. Olevich, having
sales.
said that, are you implying that there's a bigger geopolitical consideration of Russia behind this simple arms deal?
Well, of course, I would remind viewers that over the last years, 68% of India's arms imports have been from Russia. And despite Washington's attempts to change that, and it made the last-ditch effort during the 2+2 summit on September 6th, when Mattis and Mike Pompeo met their Indian counterparts, the United States was not successful at breaking down that deal. Of course, Russia is pursuing its own interests in the region in trying to counterbalance America's growing attempts to increase its influence and increase its role in the Indo-Pacific region. And considering the growing strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing, essentially for China, looking from Beijing, and increasing Russia's increasing role in India plays in China's benefit, because it also is something that counterbalances American containment policies against China. So in this way, China and Russia have in many ways similar interests in India as far as counterbalancing America's attempts to influence its policy.
Well, Mr. Olevich, thank you very much. We'll be getting back to you on this. So, gentlemen, Mr. Olevich just mentioned that 60% of India's weapon systems originate from Russia, and that is a long relationship starting from the 1960s. That was the height of the Cold War, and this time India is also going to send vintage MiG-21 fighter jets to Russia as a friendly gesture. What does this long defense relationship mean for the subcontinent, Mr. Nija?
Well, during the Cold War, it played a very important role because of in the subcontinent, for example, there was a very special relationship between Pakistan and the United States which came about. We also had an era of Sino-Soviet rivalry which takes place after 1969, etc. And then you had, from the Indian point of view, after Nixon's visit here in 1972, that there seemed to be a collaboration between America, China and Pakistan, and to balance that was the India-Russia equation. So that was the basic construct of stability in the region, I would say, which took place at that point in time. But now, at this particular juncture where we are, it's a different strategic scenario altogether. We are not in the Cold War situation, but there are problems which are coming out maybe in the Indian Ocean or maybe in South China Sea, but I don't see them as pressing security problems right now as they were during that time, which opens the door of an India-Russia relationship getting even further engagement. Let's say, can this become at some point in time, if there's a strategic dialogue between China, Russia and India, and can we then define common areas of collaboration because of the special economic relationship which is also developing, especially in the Siberia area. You had the Eastern Economic Forum quite recently, where even the Japanese came into the picture. So you had the Japanese, Russians, Chinese. I would have thought that probably India should also be a part of such a formulation. So our interests are going to converge much more in the future if we work on that track. And when our economic interests and your economic lifelines and trade lifelines start intersecting with each other, it's natural to go ahead with a security partnership to make your trade lines and your communication lines safe. So I do see that in the new context, it is not a bilateral relationship alone. Of course, we have the China-Russia, exceptionally important relationship. You had this major Vostok exercise which has just been completed. So that track is moving. The India-Russia track is moving. Russia is becoming a common factor. SCO has come into the picture. Can we connect the dots in the future and see that commensurate with the economic rise, we also add a strategic military dimension to our relationship? Long way to go, but I think time to think and talk about it.
Yes, long way to go. We'll continue this after a short break. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. Stay with us. Well, gentlemen, this major arms deal may have happy ending to have the signatures of the two countries on the paper, but still a big question hangs in the air. Will the U.S. do something about it? Because the U.S. sanctions against Russia is also targeting any other third party to do arms deal with Russia. Will that scenario happen, Professor Su?
Well, it's uncertain at the moment. We know that in recent years, the United States and Russia have very much serious confrontation with each other. In the European continent, in the Middle East, or even somehow in South Asia, regarding the Pakistan issue or the Indian relations with India. So United States at the moment would like to try to somehow to constrain the Russians' rise up, in particular in the securities backdrop. So United States would like to use the sanction means to contain Russia's influence on the Middle East or its allies or its military partners like India. So United States would like to try to some kind of pressure, make pressure on Indian side to stop taking up their arms sale deal. But I don't think that India would like to just obey the Americans' influence, right? India has independent big power.
But
so
will the United States sanction India, Mr. Nija?
Well, it can, especially the Trump administration, you can't put anything past you. Theoretically, I think that's a possibility. They would like to avoid it. But I think from the Indian perspective, the way we are moving with the Russians, you talk about S-400. There's also talk about a nuclear submarine coming from the Russians.
If the United States is going to waive off this sanction against India, will it ask India to pay a price?
Well, there would be enormous pressure which would be coming on India. I think this is a defining moment for India, in a way. Because we got to take a decision where we belong. Do we belong to Eurasia? Do we belong to the Indo-Pacific? Or do we belong somewhere in the middle, but with an accent on either side? We may have a relationship with the Americans, but dominantly, where do we belong? I think there's a big strategic question which is going to be imposed on the Indian establishment, and we'll have to take a call on that, exactly where we belong. I think that will define as to what the American response is going to be. I don't see India going deeper into as an ally of the United States, which is the objective of the United States, as like the status of Japan, Australia, and India becoming a part of it. I think that is against the grain, the way we have evolved as a nation. So I don't think that's going to happen. But from the American side of it, because when there is such intolerance now, the difficulty in dealing with gray zones, as we find the way the China-US relationship is going. So I would not put it past that further pressure comes into play. But then I think that will be self-destructive, because that will be really pushing India, Russia, China, and Central Asians in between, probably parts of Germany, parts of Europe, into a one strategic continuum. I think it will be very self-destructive. There will be many voices, senior voices in the United States, which would not want this to happen. But if there are ideological people within the administration, and they see a long-term threat, as they see in the case of China and from India, then I would not put it past that they may take the extreme step of considering sanctions against India.
And that's also a big question for Russia as well. And let's talk to Mr. Olevich again. Mr. Olevich, as we just mentioned, there are possibilities that the U.S. will sanction India due to this major arms deal with Russia. Will this further complicate the relationship between Russia and India?
Well, we have seen throughout the Trump administration's time in the White House that it has been very eager to use economic and political sanctions to impose its will on major players, on the international scene. We have seen sanctions leveled against Russia. Of course, that began in 2014, and these sanctions were made even harsher under the Trump administration. We have seen now sanctions imposed on China for arms deals with Russia, and we have seen threats to impose sanctions on Turkey, which is actually a member of NATO and a close military ally of the United States, exactly for the same type of agreement as India has struck with Russia, because Turkey has also bought S-400, the very same air defense system as India. And every time these sanctions have been either imposed or threats to impose these sanctions have been made, those nations that they were directed against have not bended, not once. Because the instruments that the Trump administration is attempting to use are not only not effective, they're not only ineffective, but as one of my colleagues pointed out, they're actually self-destructive. The more these sanctions are used as an instrument to dictate American foreign policy goals to its partners and even its allies, the more these other states, including Russia, including China, including Turkey, and possibly India, are moving away from the United States, because major powers, those that want their independence and sovereignty respected, will not succumb to a dictate in the form of economic and political sanctions. There are some in the Trump administration, including the Defense Secretary, James Mattis, who understand this very well. And in fact, when the U.S. Congress wanted to, when it was working and basically negotiating the various positions of the National Defense Authorization Act, the U.S. Defense Department asked for an exclusion, for an exception for India, so that sanctions would not be automatically
So you think India would not be sanctioned by the United States under this deal? Well, thank you very much, Mr. Viktor Olovich in Moscow. Gentlemen, let's widen scope a little bit. Professor Su, do you think China should be concerned by India's strategic positioning?
Well, of course, India is a big power in the Asian continent. We stressed India's importance on the peace and the stability and the development in the Asia-Pacific region, of course, also in the Eurasian continent. So I remember some years ago, when I was in New Delhi, actually, attending the Russian dialogue. So there's a very important keyword to be used by the Indian officials and the scholars, that is Asian century. So that means India and China, we are Asian big countries. So we share common ground to keep the peace and development over this Asian continent. So China and India would like to not only just to keep their critical role for the development in the Asian countries, scope, and of course, bilateral relation between China and India is also very important, in particular for India. So India is also facing the big challenges of national development. So China would have to keep the hands for the Indian development. So that means India and China economic cooperation could be good for serve for India's national strategic needs. So that's the reason why we have good solid foundations for the cooperation between China and India. So that means we are strategic partner for the peace and development of the Asian continent.
Talking about strategic coordination within this vast region, we've already have Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Earlier, Mr. Nija, you have this notion of seeing a potential trilateral mechanism. But actually, China, Russia, and India can talk under the SCO, and they can talk economically under the BRICS mechanism, right?
I think so. And already we have the RIC grouping, Russia, India, China, within the BRICS. But that's at the level of foreign ministers. We meet every year for that. I think we can upgrade that and probably make it a heads of state annual conference. Because I think the time has come now to have a trilateral exchange. In Wuhan, we had a bilateral exchange, which was very productive. One of the outcomes, very briefly, was that we will have a 2+1 mechanism, or a China-India plus mechanism, where China and India will coordinate their position while engaging with a third country, whether it's Nepal, whether it's Sri Lanka, or maybe an African country. So that 2+1, I think, was one of the breakthroughs which was achieved. I was just wondering, while we were talking, that can we in the future also think of a 3+1, where it's not just India and China and a third country, India, China, Russia, and a third country, maybe in the African continent.
Well, let's see how it goes.
So
Thank
that's going very far.
Mr. Atul Anija and Professor Su Haoda. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Zheng in Beijing. Bye-bye.